Standing Order 43, the time for members' statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The member for Hunter.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Yesterday, the National Farmers Federation released its drought plan. Today, the National Party backbench released its own plan in response to ministers going missing on the drought. When will the Prime Minister release a national drought strategy?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We are already implementing our national drought strategy, Mr Speaker. After the National Drought Summit, which the member who asked the question attended, we released, Mr Speaker, a comprehensive set of measures that we have continued to add to since that time. And as each stage of the drought has progressed, we have stepped up our response to that drought, Mr Speaker. It began with the establishment of the National Drought Future Fund, combined with the measures to support farm household assistance directly to farmers and graziers and their families all around this country. It began as the second phase of that plan by supporting districts and communities affected by drought by putting money directly into the local councils and shires that kept their economy going, kept people in work, kept local projects proceeding to ensure that those local towns and communities denied the income that would come from the agricultural sector during a drought was getting that support. Going back to the direct assistance to farmers and graziers and their families, we were rolling out greater mental health support, which I know the member would completely agree with and endorsed at the time, ensuring that our mental health support was getting into those communities and outreaching both through remote-type access mechanisms using technology, but as well as directly by getting those counsellors. The financial counselling assistance that was provided, the angels of the drought, Mr Speaker, sitting around the kitchen tables of farmers and graziers, helping them with the decisions that they need to make. The increase to the farm household allowance that we've enabled means that over a period of just over 4 years, these families have got access to that program, and we've liberalised access to that program so they get access to it even where they have assets of $5.5 million and can earn up to $100,000 of off-farm income. They can still receive $125,000 of support to each of those families, Mr Speaker. And in the legislation that's before the House, we've ensured that there is a flexibility mechanism which will enable the government to move, considering how the drought progresses after the 30th of June next year, to do further assistance should that be required. Mr Speaker, we are responding to the drought. We will continue to respond to the drought, and people in rural and regional communities know that. And yesterday we met with the National Farmers Federation, and there was enormous overlap between the measures that we're putting in place and the measures that they are calling for. Obviously, on things like rate relief, which they have raised, Mr Speaker, that is a matter for the state and territory governments. And one of the things that the state and territory governments are also responsible for are freight and fodder subsidies, which I note the NFF did not call to be increased during the course of this drought. And so we will continue to work with the NFF and all of those in our rural districts and communities, Mr Speaker, because on this side of the House there are just so many members from rural communities who are affected by this drought, and they will continue to provide an excellent conduit for the development of policy.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded, and I call the member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister outline to the House how returning the budget to balance and keeping it there guarantees the essential services that people and families, including in my electorate of Lindsay, rely on? What are the risks to services of other policy approaches?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Lindsay. The member for Lindsay, who has come into this place along with so many others on this side of the House, Mr Speaker, they're in a rare position for people who have come into this House, Mr Speaker, for some time, and that is they're actually in this chamber as a member of Parliament, as part of a government that is actually delivering a surplus this year, Mr Speaker. We haven't seen that for some time.
12 years.
12 years, as the Treasurer reminds us, Mr Speaker, and the reason they are in a position to do that is because the stable and the certain financial management that has been pursued by this government since we first came to office. Now, there are three key things we've done to achieve that budget surplus, which will be achieved this year, Mr Speaker. Firstly, there has been getting spending under control. The reckless spending that was implemented by the previous government You know, people say that we're in Labor's debt. Well, that's true, Mr Speaker. We are in Labor's debt, Mr Speaker. There is a debt that Labor left the following government, Mr Speaker. We are in Swanee's debt, Mr Speaker. We are in Rudd's debt, Mr Speaker. We are in all of those Labor members who presided over the reckless spending's debt, and we are paying that debt off now, Mr Speaker, because we have brought spending under control, and we have ended the reckless spending of Labor, and we have got spending under control. But what we also did is we budgeted cautiously. We didn't spend money we didn't have, like mining tax revenues that never happened, but they spent the money anyway. Estimates of iron ore prices at 183 on board US forever. Never happened, but they spent the money anyway, Mr Speaker. And we've been getting Australians off welfare into work, Mr Speaker, for the last 3 years, 36 months, every single month. Employment going up and up and up and up. When you get people off welfare, they go from welfare recipients and they go to taxpayers, and that has a positive impact on the budget. But, Mr Speaker, when you do that, it means you can provide tax relief to Australians like in the member for Lindsay's electorate, as we have done as the first action of our government after being re-elected in May of this year. But it also means you can provide $20.5 million for breast care nurses through the McGrath Foundation, $13.7 million for the National Action Plan for Endometriosis, $39.5 million to immunise pregnant women against whooping cough and provide new diagnostic imaging services, and prioritising perinatal health and putting $503 million into youth mental health and suicide prevention, which is a cornerstone objective of this government, and putting $11.5 billion in benefits and support to veterans and their families, and $30 million to establish a network of 6 veterans wellbeing centres across the nation. When you have a strong budget, that's what you can do, Mr Speaker.
And I call the member for Bendigo.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. In the face of the drought crisis, what additional measures are being provided by the government to people like farm hands, stock hands, shearers, jackaroos, gillaroos, people who depend upon agriculture for their livelihoods but are not farmers?
The Prime Minister has a call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I'm happy for the Minister for Drought to respond to the answer, and the Minister representing the Minister for Agriculture. The second phase, Mr Speaker, of our drought plan involves investing in local communities, which keeps local communities actually turning over in their economy. But what the member may not be aware of is the additional taxation incentives we provided to farmers, particularly in the building of silage, which is done by the very contractors you're talking about, and farm hands, and also $50 million in grants to farmers to support the work they're doing on-farm water infrastructure. And the member may not be aware, but that's also done by people who work on farms, the turkey nests and all of this sort of infrastructure. So, Mr Speaker, our comprehensive drought response, and those recommendations came from directly engaging with our farming communities, and I'll ask the Minister for Drought to add further to the answer.
The Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and it is a good question because it actually underlines the complexity of the drought, and that it reaches far beyond just the farm gate. It goes into the communities, as the Prime Minister has clearly articulated, on some of those programs that are about making sure there is a stimulation within the communities, but also at the farm gate. And adding on that is the commitment we've made over the lifetime of this drought, which has been 8 years. We haven't just started this yesterday. We've been on this journey for 8 years, and over $50 million have been put into pests and weeds. Let me tell you what that has done, and I can give you a perfect example of my own electorate. In Western Queensland and Central Western Queensland, they built these things called dog fences that have meant that while they have been destocked, our farmers have been able to build fences with the aid of their workers to be able to put up fences that exclude wild dogs, so that when it does rain, we are now seeing lambing rates go from 5% to 85%. That brings shearers back into these communities, about making sure that we diversify the economic base by bringing shearers who invariably leave more money at the cafes and the pubs and the surveys than most others. So that is the complexity, and that is why our 3-pillar approach to this drought is about the here and now. It's about making sure there is money in farmers' pockets in the here and now to keep them going with dignity and respect, to put an environment around them with rural financial councils and concessional loans. It's about the community and understanding that it goes further than just the farmer. It's the families that support those farmers, and that's why we've looked at these programs that will continue to stimulate, and the Future Drought Fund that will continue to deliver programs and that will give the resilience that we need in the future. That's how you tackle this insidious disease that is drought. It's not the same as other natural disasters where you can measure it by fixing a house or a road. It depletes landscapes and bank balances, and so you have to escalate your approach, your delivery, right through the community, from the farm gate to those that work within the communities to make sure there is regional and rural survival.
The minister's time has concluded. I call the member for Nichols.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister inform the House how the Morrison-McCormack government's stable and certain budget is guaranteeing delivery of infrastructure for regional Australia, particularly in my seat of Nichols, in this current year? And is the Deputy Prime Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And in this year and beyond, we are going to be certainly helping the people of the good electorate of Nichols, very well represented by the member for Nichols, Mr Speaker. And this government, of course, has a $100 billion 10-year pipeline of investment, and we're getting out and we're delivering it. I would like to acknowledge the member for Nichols for his unwavering advocacy for better projects, for better roads, making sure that the people of Nichols have the projects that they need, have the infrastructure that they expect. Commitments such as the first stage rebuild of the GV Health site on Corio Street in Shepparton. Now, Matt Sharp, who's the CE of GV Health, is in the building today. He said the reason why this is so important is because it will give us the chance to increase the access available for children, young people and their families across the region for these really important health services. But in addition, we've also got the Echuca-Moama Bridge, upgrading the train line to Shepparton. We've committed $208 million to the Shepparton bypass. Wouldn't have happened without the member for Nichols' advocacy. Wouldn't have happened without his campaigning. He made sure that this project was front of mind for myself, for the government, and we're getting on and we're going to deliver it. All job-creating projects in the Goulburn Valley.
The member for Hunter. No, the Deputy Prime Minister still has the call.
He's very noisy today, Mr Speaker. He must be also very much delighted with the infrastructure rollout that we're doing. We're seeing right across Australia excavators on site, high-vis vests everywhere, Mr Speaker. And since 2013, we've announced 900 major projects, 300 which are completed and 160 of which are under construction. These projects are job creators, such as North Connects, $412 million, 8,700 jobs in New South Wales. The Bruce Highway Upgrade Program, $10 billion, more than 7,200 jobs. Monash Freeway Upgrade, millions of dollars, 1,000 jobs. West Connects, $1.5 billion, 10,000 jobs. Metronet in Western Australia, $2.3 billion, 17,000 jobs. M80 Ring Road in Victoria, $500 million. That should delight the member for Jagga, 1,350 jobs. Midland Highway upgrade in Tasmania, $400 million, 1,068 jobs. Parks to Narromine section of the Inland Rail, 890 jobs. Now that's in a community, in those communities along that section where 10 jobs, Mr Speaker, 10 jobs would be a bonus. There are 890 jobs being created by that 1,700-kilometre corridor of commerce. We're getting on, we're delivering it, we're building it. Through a stable and certain budget, we can build even more infrastructure, and we will. More jobs, more projects, more delivery than ever occurred under those opposite.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that corporate profits are growing at 6 times the pace of wages, and the increase in electricity prices has been triple wage growth over the last 3 years? The increase in medical and hospital service prices has been triple wage growth since 2013, and the increase in childcare prices has been double wage growth since 2013. When will the government present a plan to get wages moving again?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I can confirm that real wages is growing at 0.7%, which is above the historical average of 0.6%, and compared to just 0.5% when Labor was last in office, Mr Speaker. I can confirm that the growth in the National Wages Bill, otherwise known as compensation of employees, is 5% higher through the year compared to just 3.5% when Labor was in office, Mr Speaker. I can confirm that since the Coalition came to office, the minimum wage has never dropped below inflation, but when Labor were last in office, those on the minimum wage were hit by real wages cuts in 3 out of 6 years, Mr Speaker. And I can confirm that the RBA Governor has said of our tax cuts, we estimate that they will boost household disposable income by roughly 0.6 or 0.7% of income, and that is a sizable boost, Mr Speaker. Don't look at what Labor says, look what Labor does, and when it comes to the economy, we're the only party that delivers more jobs, lower taxes and a balanced budget.
The member for Lyons is warned. The member for Melbourne.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, and it's about the connection between thermal coal, global warming and drought. When will the Prime Minister apologise to the communities being told that...
Member for Melbourne will resume his seat. Members on my right will cease interjecting. The member for Melbourne is entitled to ask his question, and I'm entitled to hear it. The member for Melbourne.
When will the Prime Minister apologise to the communities being told that they might run out of water and the farmers suffering through record drought for exporting record amounts of thermal coal and making the climate crisis worse?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I can confirm that based on the discussions I've had, particularly with the New South Wales Government, that the situation being faced by particularly those towns in New South Wales which are confronting those dreadful water shortages, that they have measures already in place to ensure that those towns will continue to get access to water until the first quarter of next year, and they have plans in place then to see how that needs to be rolled out beyond that point. Whether it's state governments or the Commonwealth Government, we are taking all the measures that are required and that are being urged and working with the rural sector to ensure that they're getting the financial support and the other forms of support they need to be able to work through what is this dreadful drought. Now, Mr Speaker, the member makes references to our resources industry and seeks to blame the resources industry for our drought. I don't share that view, Mr Speaker. I don't share that view, and because the resources sector has also been one of the greatest supporters of rural communities in this country. And I particularly remember during those dreadful and devastating floods in North Queensland, which I visited so soon after. You know whose machinery and equipment came in to get those rotting carcasses off those farmers' properties, which were breaking their heart? It was the mining companies, and it was coal mining companies lending a hand with local communities, putting their arms around them and helping them restore. Mr Speaker,
the Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for Melbourne on a point of order.
Just on relevance, there's a 1 minute and a half left to go, and the Prime Minister hasn't mentioned global warming once.
The member for Melbourne will resume his seat. The member for Melbourne will resume his seat. Members on my right will cease interjecting. I'm just going to say to the member for Melbourne and other members asking questions, just because they mention something in their question, ministers aren't required to mention those words in their answer. They have to be relevant to the answer. So there's no point of order. The Prime Minister is being relevant to the question. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Let me make it really clear. I don't think our mining industry is responsible for the drought.
Just before I call the member for Barara, I'd like to inform the House we have present in the Speaker's Gallery this afternoon Sonia Ryan, the CEO of the Carly Ryan Foundation. And as many members will know, Sonia is a child protection campaigner and is dedicated to keeping children safe online. On behalf of the House, I extend a warm welcome to you. The member for Barara.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer explain to the House how the Morrison government's stable and certain approach to jobs creation has helped strengthen our economy in the face of international headwinds? Is the Treasurer aware of any policies that might jeopardise this strong jobs growth?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Barara for his question. He's a former councillor, lawyer advocate, fierce advocate on behalf of the constituents in his electorate. He may have not received a knighthood like the member for Rankin, Mr Speaker, but he is certainly a very fierce advocate. Now, Mr Speaker, when we came to government, unemployment was higher. When we came to government, unemployment had been higher at 5.7%. The participation rate had been lower than it is today. $240 billion of deficits had been accumulated. And in Labor's last year in government alone, 65,000 small businesses had closed their doors, Mr Speaker. Now, with that record in office from the Labor Party, you can imagine how astounded I was to read the member for Rankin's book called Glory Days, where he described Wayne Swan's legacy, and I quote, as a combination of the best macroeconomic management in the developed world, combined with a reform agenda headlined by carbon pricing and resource taxation, the fruits of which are yet to be properly understood, Mr Speaker.
It's unfair.
The fruits of which are yet to be properly understood. They're probably not properly understood, Mr Speaker, because they gave us a mining tax that produced no revenue. They gave us cash for clunkers. They gave us pink bats, Mr Speaker, and they gave us accumulated deficits of $240 billion. Now, Mr Speaker, yesterday I may have inadvertently misled the House, Mr Speaker, because I described the book Glory Days as a historical fiction, Mr Speaker. Well, I now think it was a romantic novel, Mr Speaker. A romantic novel because it looks at the Labor Party's time in office with rose-coloured glasses and fails to look over their failures. Now, in contrast, Mr Speaker, we have helped create nearly 1.5 million new jobs, Mr Speaker. As the Prime Minister has said, our tax cuts, our investment in infrastructure, our new apprenticeships, our free trade agreements, our cutting of regulation, Mr Speaker, has seen for the last 3 years every single month jobs growth, Mr Speaker. That is a record that has not ever been seen, Mr Speaker. We have never seen before 3 years of every single month of having jobs growth, Mr Speaker, and we are committed to a surplus budget in 2019-2020 after delivering the first balanced budget in 11 years, Mr Speaker. Only the Coalition will continue to cut your taxes, create more jobs and deliver responsible economic management with the surplus budget.
The Manager of Opposition Business has
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that cuts to penalty rates and a tax on unions are deliberate design features of the Morrison government's plan to keep wages low?
The Minister for Industrial Relations and Leader of the House has the call.
Thank the member for his question. Absurd as it is, and of course the point he seeks to make is completely wrong. Let's consider this for a moment. And of course, in my portfolio, part of the carriage is the consideration through the FWC of the minimum wage. So let's just think about the minimum wage for a moment. The minimum wage has increased by a total of 9.8% in recent years. In the last 3 years, that has been far in excess of inflation. Right at the moment, our lowest paid workers have never seen a real wage decrease under the Coalition. Our lowest workers have never seen
Leader of the House
a
just
real
pause
wage.
for a second? Every time the member for Gorton interjects, he prevents me hearing part of the answer. Okay, I don't want him to interject. Otherwise, I'll have to try and negotiate getting him shifted with the Chief Government Whip. The Leader of the House has the call.
Mr Speaker, I'm happy to put that fact again. Our lowest paid workers have never seen a real wage decrease under the Coalition. Under Labor, the minimum wage was cut in real terms 3 out of 6 years. 3 out of 6 years. Under the Coalition, Mr Speaker, the minimum wage in Australia is the highest minimum wage in the world. So we are happy to receive questions day in, day out about the way in which our policies are benefiting every working Australian. When you look at wages and entitlements, we have done enormous work with the FWO. The Fair Work Ombudsman's received more than $60 million in additional funding in recent years. They're recovering 64% more in lost wages and underpaid wages than when Labor was in office. And of course, it's the case that we now have the lowest rate of welfare dependency since the 1980s. Whereas you moved hundreds of thousands of people from work into welfare, our government has moved hundreds of thousands of people from welfare into work. And our track record in ensuring that working Australians are better off than the disastrous policies that you enacted is clear for all to see.
The member for Groom has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. Will the minister update the House on how the Morrison government is reducing power prices for hard-working Australians, including in my electorate of Groom? Is the minister aware of any alternative policies?
The Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Groom for his question. Of course, he lives in and supports one of the energy capitals of Australia in Toowoomba and surrounding areas, Mr Speaker. And as this House knows, just a few hours ago we passed the big stick legislation through this place. We passed it through this post, Mr Speaker, and that legislation puts energy customers back in control, Mr Speaker, and stops the big energy rip-offs that we've seen in the past. Now, Mr Speaker, the ACCC described the behaviour that has been going on in this market as unacceptable and unsustainable. And this legislation deals with distortion and manipulation of the wholesale market, a failure to contract with small new entrants coming into the marketplace, and a failure to pass on substantial and sustained savings to customers, Mr Speaker, all of which will deliver a fairer deal on electricity for Australians. But this is just one piece of our broader plan, because on the 1st of July we put into place price caps, a default market offer on standing offers, and that ensures that the most vulnerable Australians get a better deal on energy, up to $663 in New South Wales, for instance, Mr Speaker. And we've also put into place the reference price, which ensures that customers can choose the best plan for themselves on an apples-for-apples basis, and we're seeing results. Already the ABS is telling us we're seeing downward pressure on prices, Mr Speaker, but there is a risk. There is a risk, Mr Speaker. Those opposite are calling for a climate emergency. And we know from the Greens what that means. It means no oil, no gas and no coal, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, it means no power, no cars, no jobs and no idea from those opposite, Mr Speaker, no idea from those opposite. And that's why the member for Hunter and his merry band has said enough. It's time to join with a coalition and be bipartisan more broadly on these policies, Mr Speaker.
On my right.
But the Leader of the Opposition and the member for Hindmarsh have taken a leaf out of Extinction Rebellion's book, and they have glued themselves to the Greens, Mr Speaker. That's right, Mr Speaker. Nigel No Friends over there, the member for Hindmarsh, who declared his climate emergency on his own.
Just say to the minister,
on his own.
Minister can pause for a second. We're going to refer. You can just pause, I said. And that's exactly the problem. So ministers will refer to members by their correct titles. Otherwise, we're slipping back into that. Well, I'm not. Ministers are slipping back into that habit. Members of the opposition are. I'll take you back a year or so. The way I fixed this was simply to sit ministers down, and I'll start doing it again. And it fixed it within a day. So take some corrective action. The minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I stand corrected. The member for Hindmarsh has found a friend. He's found the Greens. He's glued himself to the Greens, Mr Speaker, with his climate emergency. Whilst those opposite dither around, we get on with delivering our commitments to the Australian people.
Just before I call the member for Sydney, I'd also like to inform members we have present in the gallery this afternoon the Honourable Chris Pearce, former member for Aston, former parliamentary secretary and former electoral neighbour of mine. welcome on behalf of everyone. And I'll call the member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Prime Minister. Why did the Prime Minister say we want to really lift the status of vocational education in Australia when the truth is that under his government there are now 150,000 fewer apprentices and trainees? The Australian Industry Group says that 3/4 of businesses surveyed can't find the qualified staff they need, and TAFE training and apprenticeship programs have been shortchanged by nearly $1 billion.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, I've learnt from long experience with the member for Sydney never to take at face value any information, including on geography, that she presents to this House, Mr Speaker. The figures she refers to regarding the spending of the government, she knows full well, relate to estimates variations for a demand-driven project. And the only difference in expenditure from previous estimates relates to demand and the measures that are required to meet that demand. Now, that member would also know, Mr Speaker, if that is the case, if there's an adjustment between a measure that is published at a particular amount and then demand is less than that, then the amount spent is less. And she would know that because when she was Minister for Health, if that's the case, there was a $1.5 billion underspend on hospitals, Mr Speaker. Or there was a $1.5 billion underspend on schools under the Labor Party, or a $500 million underspend on carers, or a $400 million underspend on veterans, Mr Speaker. Or indeed a $1.2 billion underspend on seniors, a $350 million underspend on carers again. Now, Mr Speaker, she can come to this dispatch box and put these mistruths as an attempt to buy relevance and seek to smear the government. The facts, Mr Speaker, just don't bear what the member is saying out. Now, when it comes to the serious issue, though, as well, Mr Speaker, when it comes to the number of apprentices, we have that commitment to establish 80,000 additional apprentices as we set out at the last election. And we agree, and I would hope members opposite would agree, because I'm certainly making constructive progress with the state premiers and chief ministers of the territories, that our skills system needs big change, because it's not delivering the outcomes, Mr Speaker, that we would want it to achieve. And these programs are run by the states and supported by the Commonwealth. And we need a completely different approach to how we're doing this, Mr Speaker, and that's what we're working with the states and territories to achieve. And I'm looking forward to our next round of COAG measures. To Mr Speaker, I'm happy to keep speaking over the interjection. She's asked the question. I'm happy to answer her. And so we're going to continue to work constructively with the states and territories to reform our vocational education system. The third point I'd make is this. When we came, Mr Speaker, to government, we had to pick up the absolute debacle mess of vet fee help. This was, and the figures that even the Leader of the Opposition are pointing to refer to it, because the reason the number of people came off is we fixed the vet fee help mess and we're no longer paying people for courses they weren't doing and were being registered as being trained. See, on our side of the House, we want people to get actually trained for a real job, Mr Speaker.
The member for Reid.
My question is to the Minister for Population, Cities and Urban Infrastructure. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government's stable and certain financial position is enabling us to deliver congestion-busting infrastructure across Australia this year, including in Western Sydney, which creates jobs and gets Australians home sooner and safer? And is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Population, Cities and Urban Congestion.
Well, can I thank the member for Reid for her question and her outstanding advocacy of Western Sydney. Mr Speaker, because of our strong, stable, certain financial management, we are able to invest in a record $100 billion in infrastructure right across this country over the decade. And that means, Mr Speaker, that right now there are 130 major projects underway supporting 50,000 people in work. And one of those giant projects that is being supported is one that I know the member for Reid is very supportive of, and that is the WestConnex project. And to put the size of this project in perspective, this $17 billion project is more than double the investment in today's dollars than the iconic Snowy Mountain hydro scheme was back in the day. And that's just one of the giant projects that we're doing. And as the member for Reid knows, we're halfway through the construction of this project in partnership with the New South Wales Government, and it's already making a massive difference for families in Western Sydney. Because as the member for Reid knows, if a resident is travelling from Parramatta to the CBD and back each day in peak hour traffic, they are saving over 5 hours a week in travel time because of the work of the WestConnex project. And of course, that's just one. I mean, in Western Sydney as well, we have the giant Western Sydney Airport under construction as we speak, supporting 11,000 jobs in the construction phase. 28,000 jobs will be supported in the delivery phase. And then
Members on my left.
we've got the Inland Rail project, $9 billion. We've got coming up, we've got the Tulla Rail in Melbourne, $5 billion. Fast Rail to Geelong, $2 billion. All of these giant nation-building projects able to be done because we are able to manage the budget. And, Mr Speaker, I'm asked about alternatives, and the alternative is stark. Because when the Labor Party was last in government for their long 6 years and the Leader of the Opposition was the Transport Minister for the entire time, they weren't able to invest at the same rate that we were able to. And so when you look at that, they talked a lot about investing in nation-building projects, but they couldn't deliver. So when you look at WestConnex, for example, you had the member for Grayndler as Transport Minister saying that this was vitally important for Western Sydney families, but didn't invest a cent. When you talk about the Western Sydney Airport, he actually said that we need to start the work now, he said, in 2009. Didn't invest a cent. In relation to Inland Rail, not a sod turned. In relation to Fast Rail, he talked and he talked and he talked. But of course it was the Fast Rail that never came. They were all talk, no action, because they couldn't manage the finances.
The Minister's time has concluded. And I call the member for Chifley.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industrial Relations. Minister, how many workers have died in workplace accidents over the last year?
The Minister for Industrial Relations.
I'll have to take that on notice and provide the number, but of course any number above zero is too many. I mean, this government takes enormously seriously those issues, and those are matters that are part of a very broad approach. And indeed, recently at the Ministerial Council for Ministers for Industrial Relations, those issues were front and centre, including the way in which laws around manslaughter could be better drafted or better enforced. So it's a very serious matter. I apologise, I do not have the exact number to hand, but I'll take that on notice and get it for you.
The member for Grey.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Communications, Cyber Safety and the Arts. My question to the Minister for Communications, Cyber Safety and the Arts, will the Minister update the House on how the Morrison government's stable and certain approach to the rollout of the NBN is successfully connecting rural and regional Australia right now, and is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Communications.
Well, I do thank the member for Grey, who of course represents one of the really big electorates in this place, and he knows, as do so many members on this side of the House, just how critical modern communications is to the people of regional and remote Australia, so that they can stay connected, they can stay safe, they can do business, their children can be educated, they can enjoy all the benefits of connectivity that we take for granted in the cities. And of course, on our side of the House, we are absolutely committed to rolling out communication services to regional and remote Australia. And that's why it's so important that we've been able to take a stable and certain approach to the rollout of the national broadband network, in contrast, of course, to the alternative approach that I'm asked about, which was the chaotic mess we inherited from Labor when we came to government in 2013. After 6 years, Labor had spent $6.5 billion. There were barely 50,000 premises connected to the fixed line network. Every target that Labor had set had been missed. and by contrast today over 10 million premises are now able to connect, over 6 million premises are connected, and every week, Mr Speaker, every week 35,000 premises being connected, in contrast to the grand total of the 50,000 I mentioned that Labor achieved across 6 years. And thanks to that stable management, we are also able to focus on getting better services in regional and remote Australia. Services like Sky Muster, the satellite service, where in the electorate of Grey over 15,000 premises are able to be served. And recently in Dubbo, I joined with the member for Parkes to launch Sky Muster Plus. Under this evolution of NBN satellite, we now provide unmetered data for essential daily tasks such as banking, accessing health or government services, software updates, emails. None of this will count towards a household's daily, monthly data allowance, and that has been very well received in regional and remote Australia because, Mr Speaker, our members of parliament on this side of the House don't live inside the goat's cheese circle like most of the people on the other side of the House. They live in regional and remote Australia, and they understand the needs of the people of regional and remote Australia, and that is why we are tailoring the products delivered over the NBN to the needs of people in regional and remote Australia, including the new satellite service Sky Muster Plus.
The member for McMahon is warned. Members on my right, the Manager of Opposition Business.
Do you want some quince paste with that goat cheese?
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industrial Relations. The federal court found Liberal Party member and donor Jerry Hansen was driven by a blind hatred of unions when he blocked safety inspectors from a site where a worker had died. Can the Minister confirm the only new penalty that the government currently has before the Parliament for Jerry Hansen is that he won't be allowed to run as a union official?
The Minister for Industrial Relations has the call.
Mr Speaker, all those people who breach the industrial laws of Australia should be prosecuted, should go before the relevant courts and be fined and punished in accordance with the law, as of course was the case with Mr Hansen. As the Shadow Minister knows well, the laws that we have placed in the Ensuring Integrity Bill are designed to apply to the disqualification of members of registered organisations as officials, equally to organisations that represent employers and organisations that represent employees. As the member knows, the changes in the Ensuring Integrity Bill that go to the issue of a potential deregistration after evidence is put by the Registered Organisation Committee to a court and after their dutiful consideration of that evidence apply equally to organisations which are registered as employer or employee organisations. The very point of those laws is to ensure lawful conduct according to the same standards of both employer and employee organisations.
The member for Curtin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Indigenous Australians. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government's stable and certain economic management is helping to close the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians by guaranteeing essential services?
Good. The Minister for Indigenous Australians.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Curtin, particularly in her former role as the Vice-Chancellor of Notre Dame University, where her work there was also focusing on creating opportunities for Indigenous people studying to go on and be successful in their careers and contribute to our economy. But I also want to acknowledge the member for Kooyong and the member for Cook for the work they've done in establishing a strong budget to enable us to grow the initiatives for Indigenous Australians. In the 2019-20 budget, we confirmed $5.2 billion towards investments in key and critical areas that will make a difference to the lives of Indigenous Australians. In areas of employment, job creation, educational opportunities, getting kids to school, and that's what we're focused on. We're focused on making a difference in the lives of all Indigenous Australians across this nation.
the Indigenous procurement policy. That has resulted in 1,765 Indigenous businesses being extremely successful in taking on 16,460 contracts. That's $2.49 billion going into the pockets of Indigenous people who have established very successful businesses. But what they're doing is they're employing other Indigenous members within their communities, taking them off welfare dependency and creating job opportunities that are providing a tremendous way forward. But equally, we're tackling suicide. The number of young Indigenous Australians committing suicide are far too many. And what we're doing is we are investing in initiatives that will see a whole-of-community approach. What I've noticed in some of the reports is that school plays a critical part in the networks of connectivity. In the Kimberley Coronial Inquiry, there were suicides occurring during the school holidays, which demonstrated the importance of our work in engaging our children into educational pathways from preschool through to tertiary studies. All of us are working in that direction, and a strong budget gives us the capacity to have the resources. The Jabiru tourism venture, the work that we have just announced in terms of $40 million for tourism in Indigenous communities will add to the work that we do collectively in this House to make a difference in Indigenous communities. But our continued work around our economy will give us greater capacity to make a difference on the ground in the way in which we provide opportunity. I want to see, and collectively we all want to see, success, because that is the way in which we will change the dynamic within Aboriginal communities. And I thank those involved for the work that we are collectively doing.
The Leader of the Opposition, briefly on indulgence.
Yes, Mr Speaker. Just very briefly, Labor stands with the government on recognising that the Indigenous youth suicide rates are just horrific, and we stand ready to partner with the government and to support any initiatives to reduce that rate as a matter of urgency.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industrial Relations. Previously in the House, the Minister refused to acknowledge that industrial action taken by unions against James Hardie on behalf of asbestos victims would have seen those unions potentially deregistered under the government's Ensuring Integrity Bill had it been in place. Why won't the Minister admit his legislation would give companies like James Hardie a weapon to avoid scrutiny and get away with appalling behaviour?
The Minister for Industrial Relations and the Leader of the House.
I won't admit that because it's not true. I mean, it's just patently false. And indeed, the falsehood of that goes back to, I believe, the ACTU media release that was released on the day that you first asked these questions. And that release, I recall, said something to the effect that the Ensuring Integrity Bill would make it harder for individuals to get right of entry to workplaces to check for occupational health and safety concerns. That is 100% false. Nothing in the Ensuring Integrity Bill changes one iota of the law about the present rights to access workplaces for occupational health and safety reasons. That is a falsehood, and it's that falsehood that forms the premise of the question that you've just asked. And if we're talking about occupational health and safety, which of course we are in the subject matter of the question, one fascinating thing is that there's great concern for occupational health and safety by members opposite, but yet they ignore the fact that the Queensland Public Sector Union, that has in its membership inspectors for occupational health and safety, has instructed its inspectors not to go to work sites where the CFMEU is present because of fear for those workers.
The Manager of so the Leader of the House will just resume his seat for a second. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Thanks. It's on direct relevance, Mr Speaker. There is no example that the Minister has gone to that in any way relates to the sorts of actions that were taken by unions with respect to James Hardie over asbestos victims.
So I just say to the Manager of Opposition Business, and I can hear his interjections, some of the points he's now seeking to make by way of interjection prior to raising the point of order, I've got to say, weren't immediately clear in the question. and the minister can only answer the question he's been asked. What I'm really saying, if you want him to be more specific on the points you were making in those interjections, you'd need to hang on. I'll just finish first. You'd need to be a bit more specific in the question, I think. I mean, I've got a summary of the question which went to a previous answer and then quite a general point about companies being able to get away with what I think you've said appalling or harmful activity. The manager of opposition business has
the question is specific that it's referring to the industrial action taken by unions against James Hardie. It's not referring to occupational health and safety inspections. It's referring to the industrial action that was taken after James Hardie had transferred their assets offshore.
And that's the point I was making.
No, but the assets offshore, I respect, but there is nothing here.
Members on my right.
There is nothing here in the question that refers to right of entry on an occupational health and safety inspection.
All right, I've heard from the manager.
It's about the industrial action, which he hasn't referred to at all, and that's what the entire question is premised on.
All right, well, I'll make 2 points. The leader of the House and the minister has been asked the question. He's been given some context, but the point about moving assets offshore, I mean, it's, well, someone says, you should know. Well, look, if you want to ask a question, just ask the question. It's not. That's the simplest thing to do. Okay, whoever that was, that's sort of not a good way to sort of try and get ministers to answer something they weren't specifically asked. The Minister for Industrial Relations.
And again, nothing in the Ensuring Integrity Bill stops lawful industrial action. Nothing in the Ensuring Integrity Bill prevents occupational health and safety inspectors from entering workplaces. But one thing that is stopping health and safety inspectors entering workplaces is the militant, bullying behaviour of the CFMEU, which members opposite refuse to call out, refuse to do anything about, and the effect of that is that occupational health and safety inspectors in Queensland Public Sector Union will not go to 17 of the largest construction sites in Queensland. That displays the sort of concern that you have for the realities that these people are dealing with.
The member for McMahon has already been warned. The member for Stirling.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Veterans and Defence Personnel. Will the Minister update the House on how the Morrison government's certain and stable budget position has helped to deliver essential services to veterans and their families?
The Minister for Veterans Affairs and Defence Personnel. Members on my left.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Stirling for his question? And I will note his service in the Australian Army, and I say to him, as I say to all members in this place on both sides of the chamber, thank you for your service. And Australians, Mr Speaker, can be proud of the support we provide to our veteran community and their families. And more than $11.5 billion in this year's budget will go towards supporting around 280,000 veterans and their families. And it's due to the strong budget position that we've been able to have a record investment in the transformation of the Department of Veterans Affairs over the last 3 budgets. In fact, an additional $500 million has been provided for the Department of Veterans Affairs for that transformation program, which has made it faster, easier, less stressful for the majority of veterans making their claims through the digitisation of records, which has been welcomed right throughout the ex-service community. And I'll say also, Mr Speaker, that that strong budget has allowed for greater investment in mental health programs across our nation. In fact, $230 million per year is provided for our veterans to support them if they're suffering from mental illness or need some assistance of a professional nature. And this government has been able to introduce free lifetime health care for all veterans and their families. And for those veterans listening today who may be struggling with their own mental health, I encourage them to contact the Open Arms number on 1800 011 046. That's 1800 011 046. And I was also pleased to announce, Mr Speaker, during the election period and Since that period, there has been bipartisan support for the 6 new wellbeing centres which are being developed across our nation, many of them in members' opposite seats, but also on the crossbench, and several of them on this side of the chamber. And also in this year's budget, Mr Speaker, there was $16 million in additional funding to assist with veterans' employment initiatives working with the ex-service community. So all initiatives, Mr Speaker, that have been made possible through a strong budget position. And just yesterday, Mr Speaker, just yesterday in this place we had bipartisan support for legislation which seeks to better recognise, offer respect to our veterans on a daily basis, not just on Anzac Day, not just on Remembrance Day, but throughout the year. And I was pleased to receive the support of those opposite in terms of the new Veterans Card, that nationally identifiable Veterans Card, which will be made available to veterans throughout our nation, the Veterans Covenant, which has had strong support right throughout the nation over the past 12 months, and the new Veterans Lapel Pin. And I'll be making those the information about the distribution of the Veterans Lapel Pin available to members opposite and members on this side of the chamber in the coming days, how they can be involved personally in the distribution of those pins in their own community if they so wish to be involved. And I realise, Mr Speaker, that props are unparliamentary, but in this case I would like to just demonstrate to the House that this new pin will be available for everyday public recognition of our veterans throughout the nation. And it's a simple way that I think, as a community, as members of Parliament—
Minister's fine to display that. I don't regard it as a problem.
It's a simple way, I think, Mr Speaker, where we can all acknowledge our veterans on a daily basis and say to them simply, thank you for your service.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industrial Relations. The Minister has assured the House that the Ensuring Integrity Bill would have no impact on a campaign like the one run by unions against James Hardie. Does the Minister even know what actions the unions took to bring James Hardie to account?
The Minister has the call.
Well, the members completely mischaracterised the answer. What I have informed the House is that the Ensuring Integrity Bill does absolutely nothing to prevent lawful protests, lawful strike, lawful entry to premises. What is it that members opposite are suggesting? What is it that you're suggesting? That as a government we should accept any action at any time, even if that action breaks the law? Is that what the opposition members are asking? That is what the opposition members are asking us to accept. That might explain why they have this passive acceptance of what the CFMEU does. That might explain why they are willing to accept $16 million in fines for the CFMEU. That might explain why they're willing to passively accept 2,164 offences by the CFMEU without ever taking action. What our government has always said is that behaviour on work sites with respect to workers' benefit fund bills, whether that is employee organisations, whether that is employer organisations, must be within the law. It must be within the law. And this bill ensures that there are appropriate standards in place, as there always should be, to ensure that organisations that repetitively break the law are placed before a court so a court can make a determination whether it is just in all the circumstances for that organisation or a part of that organisation to be deregistered. And the only organisation in Australia who looks even close to meeting that important standard would be the organisation that you regularly accept enormous amounts of money from, that being the CFMEU.
The member for Robertson has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is for the Minister presently representing the Minister for Women. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government's stable and certain budget position is supporting women's services and economic security? Is the Minister aware of any alternative policies?
The Minister representing the Minister for Women.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Robertson for her question, acknowledge her past record in promoting women in positions of leadership and her ongoing role as a mentor in her electorate and here in the parliament. Australian women have benefited from the coalition government's success in growing an economy that creates jobs, pathways, careers, supports an education system that nurtures talent and ability. Because part of managing the economy well is getting the best people in the workforce, the best person for the job, and women are a very big part of that. Our government is investing $151 million, through the 2018 Women's Economic Security Statement to ensure that women are well positioned to play that full and equal role in every aspect of our economy. Nearly 1.5 million jobs, 1.5 million jobs, Mr. Speaker,
on my left
have been created since September 2013. And importantly, most of these jobs have been taken up by women. For example, in the recycling industry and the work we're doing with the circular economy, we know that for every 10,000 tonnes of waste recycled correctly, there are 9 new Australian jobs created, and with more and more women entering that industry. That's fantastic. This morning I was sorry to miss the Women of Waste Leadership Breakfast held in Sydney, hosted by Waste Management and Resource Recovery Association's dynamic CEO Gail Sloan. This event recognises women who are driving change in the industry, creating new career prospects for women coming up in the ranks. Increasing opportunities across all industries for workforce participation help build women's financial security and independence. Under the Morrison government, women's workforce participation is at near record high of over 61%. Over 6 million women are in employment. The average weekly ordinary time earnings for women increased 3.6% just over the last year, and the gender pay gap is at a record low, with of course more work to do in this space. Now, the member for Sydney continues to interrupt me, and look, the member for Sydney's misunderstanding is the misunderstanding, Mr. Speaker, may I say, of the modern Labor Party, because women's policy covers all portfolios, but at its heart, at the heart of women's policy is economic policy. At the heart of women's policy is economic policy. You need employers, you need trade agreements, you need the small and medium enterprise business sector, you need jobs, you need lower taxes. You need so much more than just glib statements and glib slogans. They've got the slogans, we've got the plan and the commitment to carry it through.
The member for Fraser.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. When this government oversaw a cut in penalty rates, it said there would be more jobs. Will the Prime Minister now admit that penalty rate cuts have not created a single job?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr. Speaker, I don't accept the premise of the member's question, but I am asked about jobs. Because, Mr. Speaker, I've been asked about a matter that was actually determined by the Fair Work Commission, not by the government, but by the Fair Work Commission that was actually set up by the former Leader of the Opposition. Mr. Speaker, through an independent process.
Treasurer.
So I'll leave those matters to the Fair Work Commission that was actually set up by the Labor Party. But I'm asked about jobs, Mr. Speaker. I'm asked about jobs, and I can confirm that almost 1.5 million jobs have been created by this government by supporting a framework which means business could create jobs, Mr. Speaker, in our economy. When we've done that by lowering taxes, we've done that by investing in infrastructure, we've done that by reducing the costs of doing business, we've done that by expanding the trade borders of this country, where we've gone from 26% of what we export covered by our agreements to now 70%, Mr. Speaker.
Will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Thanks, Speaker. On direct relevance, if the Prime Minister wants to link that these figures are because of the penalty rate cut, then it would be completely relevant to the question. But he's not being relevant. The question is entirely with respect to both jobs and the penalty rate cut, to the extent to which they are linked. And the Prime Minister simply reacting to one word, not being relevant to the question he was asked.
We'll just say to the members, the Minister, I'll just say this was certainly a very tight question that talked about penalty rates. The reason I was hearing the Prime Minister is, without putting words into his mouth, I wouldn't want to do that, what the area he was covering can, if the Manager of Opposition Business thinks about it for a bit, certainly be construed as his answer to the question about that topic. So I'm going to continue to hear him, but remind him that it was a very tight question about penalty rates and jobs. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. the member for Watson seems to think this is some sort of 14-year-old debating society in this chamber, Mr Speaker. What I'm talking about are people's real jobs and what our government is doing to support people getting jobs, and he wants to play semantics. Well, I'll be very clear. No, we don't believe that the decisions of the Fair Work Commission are the reasons why Australians are getting in jobs in this country. We think it's because we're lowering taxes, building infrastructure, putting trade policies in place, which they have to be dragged kicking and screaming to the table to support, Mr Speaker, by taking on big energy companies to ensure that companies and consumers can get a fair deal and continue to keep our budget under control so we can support the essential services that Australians rely on. Now, unemployment has fallen from 5.7% to 5.2% on the watch of this government. And we've ensured that the participation rate has risen to record highs, Mr Speaker. We've ensured that 85,000 over the year to September 13, Mr Speaker. That's what happened under their watch over that period of time. And over the same period of time under our watch, 311,600 jobs. Mr Speaker, more full-time jobs, more part-time jobs, more jobs, more jobs, more jobs. That's what this government is doing, Mr Speaker. Those on that side took jobs away from people, and they want to take more jobs away from people, Mr Speaker, with their reckless policies and their higher taxes. Mr Speaker, the Shadow Treasurer served at the knee of Mr Swan, Mr Speaker, and he presided over job wreckage. Now, Mr Speaker, he's at one. He's at one with the former Treasurer. He's Obi-Swan Kenobi, Mr Speaker, as he looks up to his great mentor with whom he merges, and he hears them say, "Use the taxes, Jimmy, use the taxes."
The Prime Minister has concluded his answer. Members on my right, the member for Moore.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the Minister outline to the House the importance of the Morrison government's stable and certain approach to border security? Is the Minister aware of any risks associated with alternative approaches?
The Minister for Home Affairs has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, on indulgence, can I just quickly acknowledge Sonia Ryan up in the gallery today. We've been doing a lot of work with Sonia and the Carly Ryan Foundation. Her story is a tragic one. Her beautiful 15-year-old daughter, who was online, was befriended by somebody who made out to be an 18-year-old male and turned out to be a 50-year-old sexual predator, and eventually lured Carly to a remote spot and it resulted in terrible tragedy. And now Sonia has dedicated her life to keeping children online and in the real life as safe as humanly possible. And I want to say thank you very much for the work that you're doing with the Federal Police and my department. So thank you. Well, Mr Speaker, I'm asked about the very important issue of border protection, and this government's been working day and night to keep our borders secure. We warned the Labor Party and the Greens with the passage of the Medivac bill not too long ago, Mr Speaker, that it would result in people coming to our country who pose a threat here, or in fact
say to the Minister, there is no members on my left. No, I don't need the assistance of the member for Cooper. We've just stopped the clock for a second. I'm just going to say to the Minister, and I should have addressed this in an earlier answer he's given. He's entitled to be asked about the government's policy and answer that, and be entitled to ask about the alternatives and answer that. But I don't think you can go to the alternatives without having outlined the government's policy, because otherwise it's the alternative to what? So I think, well, that's my ruling. Okay, so
I'm happy
I'm just going to make it very clear, because I'm not going to have grumbles on either side. If a minister is asked what the government's approach is, and then what the alternative to it is, it's very hard to say what the alternative to it is if you haven't outlined what the government's approach is. You're left responding to something you haven't addressed. So, and that's why I haven't called you. I mean, I don't decide the order in which the questions are asked. Okay, so he's entitled to answer both, but there has to be a structure to it. The Minister has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Well, as the Australian public knows, the border protection policies of this government are clear, consistent, they're stable and certain, and they were endorsed at the last election. They're well known, and if we're talking about alternative approaches, Mr Speaker, those opposite have presided over disaster for a long period of time, Mr Speaker.
The Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a...
Speaker, it goes to the dignity of the House.
No, the Leader of the Opposition will need to resume his seat. I know the Leader of the Opposition, I made my ruling clear that the Minister responded to that. I didn't say that he had to go for exactly half the time. He had to address the substance, and the Minister has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And as we know, under the legislation passed by those opposite, we've had people now who have come not for medical reasons, but frankly it's a con and it's a backdoor way to Australia that the Labor Party was warned about at the time, and they can feign all the indignant response that they want, Mr Speaker. But the fact is that they are a disaster.
The Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business.
I'll move that the Minister be no longer heard.
The Manager of Opposition Business has moved that the Minister be no further heard. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the noes have it. Ayes. Division required. Ring the bells for 4 minutes. Lock the doors. The question is that the Minister for Home Affairs be no further heard. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left. I point the honourable members for Lawler and Werriwa tell us for the ayes, and the honourable members for Gray and Nichols tell us for the noes. Order. The result of the division is ayes 65, noes 77. The question is therefore resolved in the negative. If members can resume their seats as quickly as possible. We're still in question time. Just saying to members, if you could resume your seats as quickly as possible, we're still in question time. The Minister for Home Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Now, the government has a bill which we've introduced to the House, the Transport Security Amendment Serious Crimes Bill, and we would expect the Labor Party to support this because it's a very important part of keeping criminals away from our airports and from our seaports. And the Labor Party has previously rejected this legislation, but the reason that it's needed, Mr Speaker, is that in Australia at the moment we have 277 security card holders at airports and seaports who have either an association with an outlaw motorcycle gang or they are on the National Criminal Target List. Now, Mr Speaker, we know that the National Criminal Target List reads like a who's who of the CFMEU, but the fact is, Mr Speaker, that we cannot allow these people into secure areas. And the Labor Party has opposed this legislation in the past, but if they are serious about securing our borders, they need to put that opposition into the past and to support us, Mr Speaker. We know that there are serious links between outlaw motorcycle gangs and the CFMEU, and that is the reason as to why the Labor Party would oppose this position. Now, who do we know in the CFMEU? We know Mr John Setka, Mr Speaker, and he had this earlier today to say about the Leader of the Opposition. He said, and I quote, "Mr Albanese claims I've brought the ALP into disrepute. Nothing has hurt the Labor Party's reputation like Mr Albanese's leadership over the past 5 years." Now, that is a pretty insightful remark, Mr Speaker, from a criminal wife-bashing thug whose donations the Labor Party is still happy to receive to this very day.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
Prime Minister, the Leader of the House.